Hello everyone, and welcome back to our coverage of Star Trek Prodigy, the absolutely brilliant children's version of Star Trek that Paramount tried to retroactively erase from existence earlier this year. Apologies in advance if I look like I'm struggling during this video. The quantity of silver glitter mascara on my face right now is making it difficult for me to see, and if I'm making like a pained, weird expression, that's why. However, I'm happy to report that pain and weirdness had nothing to do with this week's set of Prodigy episodes. Once again, the Prodigy writers, animators, and directors continue to knock it out of the park. That being said, this set of episodes had higher highs and lower lows. There were some truly incredible episodes that can stand up to the best of Star Trek overall, but we got our first set of bad plot lines and bad episodes in this set of episodes. For those of you following along, that does mean we can finally call Prodigy real Star Trek. However, this set of episodes, like the set we covered last week, is extremely dense. Every episode advances multiple characters' character arcs, multiple plot lines, and even introduces new species, new worlds. So instead what we're going to do, rather than the usual format of going through each episode individually, we're going to cover each of the 10 episodes very quickly, review them as pieces of television. Then we're going to go over each character, talk about their arc over the course of the season, and finally we're going to talk about my expectations for Season 2 and beyond. But first of all, I'd like to make some observations about this set of 10 episodes. We observed in the last set that the series felt very much like Star Wars, particularly because of the antagonism of the Diviner. In this set of episodes, the Diviner is removed as an antagonist, and his place is taken by Vice Admiral Janeway, who serves as an antagonist to the story even if she is not actually a villain. This shifts the series massively away from Star Wars and towards Star Trek. There were a lot of complaints about the first set of Star Trek Prodigy episodes because people didn't feel like the Diviner represented what a Star Trek villain should be. Star Trek is supposed to be about communicating and coming to terms with other cultures, and having a villain who is truly evil, one who enslaved children because of his superior, well, what he perceives to be his superior race, doesn't line up with the ideals of seeking understanding that Star Trek typically embodies. This season, having Janeway, a character who is much more sympathetic, brings us, the audience, much closer to the mindset that we are supposed to be in while we are watching Star Trek. But the other thing it does is it brings the Diviner closer to a place where we can start using him as a regular character instead of as a set piece. That being said, I think I should go ahead and get out of the way that Janeway's place as an antagonist this season feels difficult. The format of Part 1 and Part 2 is almost identical. You have the majority of the characters on the protostar, and the antagonist and a few other characters outside of the protostar chasing them. And a few minutes per episode we check in with the antagonist, while the protagonist avoid the antagonist for the rest of the screen time. The progression of how this moves in both sets of episodes is almost the same. The antagonist catches up with them around the halfway mark, the kids get away, they catch up with them again, they reach an understanding, they communicate, there's a big battle, the set is over. And these events happen at almost the same place. However, in the first season, the kids were trying to get away from the Diviner, and in the second season, the kids want to be closer to Janeway, and Janeway wants to be closer to the kids. They are trying to avoid her physically, but the barrier that creates the tension between the two groups is much smaller. Since the only thing preventing the kids from communicating with Janeway is the virus on their ship, the audience is left brainstorming ideas for alternative ways to communicate with Janeway for almost the entire season. It's not a positive. I would consider it a distraction that for most of the runtime of this set of episodes, the audience is thinking about, I wonder if the kids could put a piece of paper in a bottle and shoot it out the back of their shuttle bay so that Janeway's ship could pick it up and look at it. And you're thinking about this almost constantly while the plot is going on. I don't think that is good. Most of the rest of the writing in this set of episodes is on par with what we saw last set, if not better. However, the fact that what separates the two groups is so thin makes it feel like the plot runs a little bit thin. The other thing is that Dal's character development is slowed down a little bit for the sake of, I assume, us getting to his major plot point next season. This season deals a lot with Gwyn and her species and her drama, and while we are going to her home planet next season, and I'm sure we're going to get more of Gwyn, it feels like we kind of put Dal on pause a little bit. There's nothing that Dal does that's out of character or that feels especially wrong, but Gwyn was on a trajectory that looked like this for the last 2 seasons. And Dal was on a very similar trajectory, but it feels like he kind of tapered off around the middle of this season. And there are definitely points where he picks back up, but his development is definitely slower than Gwyn's right now, and sometimes it is a little bit grating. That being said, I still think Dal is an excellent protagonist, and he's still my favorite character of the set. Particularly with the developments that the story takes this season, I'm absolutely fascinated to see where this is going to go. Just this week on the Star Trek subreddit, there was an argument about whether or not it would be compelling to have a protagonist who is an augment trying to get into Starfleet. And there were tons of people participating, and Prodigy was never brought up once. It's a concept that obviously has merit and is only bolstered by the fact that Dal is certainly one of the better written characters that we've had. That being said, this week I did a little bit more reading into the discussions from the episodes as they were coming out, particularly on the specific Star Trek Prodigy subreddit, and I was disappointed to find that the discussion about Dal is literally like the worst thing I've ever seen on the internet from adults. The amount of vitriol that grown men were throwing at this teenager was inappropriate. Okay, I have to say it's definitely not the worst thing I've ever seen on the internet, but the mass of complaining was shocking to me. When I first started watching this show, Dal was not my favorite captain, and he still isn't. But I didn't think he was already an adequate captain at the beginning. However, I watched it, I saw his flaws, and I anticipated that we were going to address them. I know that I had a bit of an advantage in that I went into this knowing that Prodigy's writing has been heavily praised and anticipating that the flaws I saw in Dal would be addressed since they were brought up. That being said, I think it's a basic expectation of storytelling that your protagonist is going to develop over the course of a series. In one particularly infuriating thread, there were comparisons made between Dal and Boimler. Boimler is one of the 2 protagonists of Lower Decks. He had a very, very similar experience to Dal's experience in the Kobayashi Maru in an episode in which he had to take a test in which he fought the Borg in a holodeck. He repeated the test hundreds of times until he could get a perfect score, and then was able to do the Borg fight perfectly, basically. In this thread, people were comparing Dal and Boimler, which makes perfect sense because the 2 situations were borderline identical, and the progression of the story was almost exactly the same. However, the adults on the subreddit were saying that it was disrespectful to Boimler to compare Dal to him because Dal is not a good character, basically. That Boimler is supposed to be read as a potential future starship captain, and that Dal is an idiot. Boimler is like 30 years old. I think he's supposed to be 28. And Dal is 17. The thing is, I used to work with teenagers, and the amount that adults, even fellow teachers, hate teenagers is astounding. We've even addressed this topic previously on this channel when we were talking about Pale. People tend to assume the worst in teenagers by default, and it's pretty infuriating. Both Lower Decks and Prodigy are about annoying dudes who are definitely going to be starship captains one day, but Boimler is extended vastly more grace by virtue of the fact that he's an adult who is already enrolled in Starfleet. I think the other reason that people were frustrated with this is because this is a children's series, and people expected to be able to turn their brain off. I watched some of these episodes 3 times, and I noticed new things and new ties to future plot points every time I watched it. But the audience at the time was expecting the show to be stupid, and then were frustrated when the show expected them to have been paying attention. This kind of saddens me because whenever I'm watching Prodigy or working on this project, I am constantly thinking about what the reaction is going to be when Prodigy airs on Netflix on Christmas of this year. As I stated in my previous video, I believe that the future of Star Trek rides on Prodigy. Not only that, I believe that Prodigy has its own merit and deserves to continue to live. So when I see grown men throwing temper tantrums about the character flaws of a series protagonist who is supposed to grow, it makes me worried about how this series is going to be received when it airs. Also, speaking of Lower Decks, I think it's fun and interesting that the two series focus really, really hard on this idea of second contact. The First Contact is great, and, it's cool that the Enterprise gets to meet all these new species, but Second Contact is as important, if not more so. Second Contact being the concept of returning to a species that you've met and introduced to the universe, and continuing to guide them through the process of joining the Federation, becoming a spacefaring civilization. Even if that guidance isn't hand-holding, just the continued presence of whatever species made contact in the first place. It parallels really, really effectively with the idea of parenting, which is obviously a strong theme in this series that is about children who have no parents, or unfortunately have parents. Prodigy and Lower Decks both make the argument that if you make first contact with a civilization, you should allow it to develop on its own, but you should also continue to be there for it. Much like how if you decide to have a child, you can't expect it to save your planet for you, but you should continue to be there and not leave her on Larry the Murder Planet if she sends you a distress signal. Anyways, let's get into the 10 episodes. We'll go over these pretty quickly, and then we'll revisit some of these points later when we talk about the characters. The first episode in this set is called Asylum. This one was definitely not my favorite. I didn't think this one was bad, but I did think it was weak. It had some really interesting ideas, but it also felt kind of pushed together, and there wasn't very much about the episode that I thought was exceptionally done well. Well, okay, the water planet was very pretty. I did think the water planet was very pretty. The first problem with this episode is obviously Gwyn's memory loss. I am not sure how they should have handled Gwyn's memory loss, because if she had just never gotten her memory back at all, it would have made no sense that her dad got his memory back later from the same incident. But at the same time, the fact that she gets her memory back the episode after she lost it feels silly and cheap. I kind of feel like maybe she should have gotten her memory back earlier, but they didn't realize what the living construct actually did and then gone to the comm station, but I'm not sure how this should have been solved. It doesn't feel perfect. It feels rough to complain about things that are off but not perfect in Prodigy, because there are so many things that Prodigy does so well that when they mess up little things, it is glaring. In this episode, the kids are headed towards Starfleet. However, on the way there, they are trying to do good deeds in the hopes that they can prove their goodness to Starfleet Academy when they show up on their doorstep having stolen a Federation starship. I was actually watching The Good Place, which stars almost all of the exact same people, the week before I started watching Prodigy. So when I saw this episode, I was immediately thinking moral desert. Moral desert being the concept that you do something good with the expectation that you will get good things because of it. The idea of Santa Claus. And ultimately, this ends up not working out. The fact that they do good deeds doesn't matter. Although it does probably teach them some important things they're going to need later on in the series about general space exploration. I pulled out this one particular sentence that I thought was very potent when I was first watching it, and it turned out that this was sort of the arc words for this set of episodes. At one point, Janeway is trying to fix Dal's uniform so that he looks more like a potential Starfleet cadet and less homeless. And he says, "They're going to see right through me. What if they don't like who I truly am?" And she says, "You have to let them see you." I don't remember the exact phrasing, but the only way they can see you is if you let them see who you truly are. These are the arc words, and I suspect these will be arc words for the rest of Dal's arc. That being, of course, that it's revealed later in the season that who Dal truly is a human augment, the only species that is not allowed to join Starfleet. But there's no use lying about it or trying to hide it. Dal, throughout this season, leads the ship in the way he sees best fit, and according to his own values that he has developed over the course of the series, and the result is that Vice Admiral Janeway defends him in court when this question comes before Starfleet Academy. My biggest complaint of the entire season, I think, is the character of Barnes Frex. Barnes Frex is the Denobulan lieutenant junior grade who mans the comm station. Entirely too much of the plot relies on how much of an idiot this guy is. I watched the accompanying special feature that came with the Blu-rays, and the creators talked about how if you have somebody who has been sent out to this farthest reach of Federation space, this person is not going to be a good officer. This is not a post that you get because you're good at what you do. It's not a reward. This is going to be one of the least competent people we're going to meet. That being said, he's so stupid, it allows the entire season to happen. The season doesn't happen if Barnes Frex is a little bit better a person. And I feel that is the weak point of the entire season. So Barnes Frex is this Denobulan guy who is assigned to man this comm station. He's there all alone. He's basically lost his mind. When the crew shows up, he's so enthusiastic that I thought he was lying. He registers all of them with Starfleet, but then their ship, which has a virus on it, infects the station, causes the defenses to turn against itself, destroying the station and requiring everyone to evacuate. And Barnes Frex doesn't hear them out. He doesn't ask any questions. He just comes to the conclusion that they are saboteurs and leaves on the only escape pod, leaving them there, and then goes on to tell Janeway that the crew of the Protostar is a bunch of savages who tried to murder him. It's not that he's particularly a bad character, it's that the badness of his performance at his job is so important to the plot. And this is the only purpose that his character has. But I did appreciate, there was one point that says, the first clue that Barnes Frex sucks is that when Gwyn walks through the scanner and it's labeled as an unregistered species, he says he's too lazy to do the paperwork to register the Vaunicott and lists her as nothing. So obviously the Vaunicott will not be made first contact with for several more years. So the first contact that anyone at Starfleet has with the Vaunicott is when Gwyn approaches this guy at this comm station. He had the opportunity to make first contact with the species, and he says he's too tired to do the paperwork and just lists her as not applicable. Great. The best thing about this episode is certainly the bit where Gwyn is locked in the tank and she sees herself as her dad locked in his liquid tank. I'm not exactly sure what that was supposed to communicate, but it was very cool. I do kind of wish that this was the point where she had remembered, because then at least that scene would have had a point. That would have absolutely been an improvement. Anyway, my other sort of complaint about this episode is that when the characters are running to get to their ship, so what happens is Frex takes the only escape pod. So the kids put on spacesuits and jump out to get to the Protostar. Now, the orbital mechanics in Prodigy are generally good for Star Trek. And the orbital mechanics here are good as well. Janeway has intentionally put the Protostar into an orbit around the space station. So the kids turn to Rock Talk and say, okay, you're the science officer. How do we get to the ship? And she says, okay, well, if the ship is orbiting the station, we have to get anywhere we go out, as long as we're perpendicular to the station, we will intersect with the orbit of the Protostar. And they're like, okay, what do we do with that? And then there's this long sequence where a bunch of like equations go over her face and she thinks about the math, which I did not like because that's not realistic. I think it was fantastic that Rock Talk made this very accurate observation about the way they were going to need to get to the ship. However, no scientist, no matter how intelligent, can make those calculations without measurements. I feel like there would have been a better way to show Rock Talk making that deduction in a way that somebody could actually do it. If you watch any other Star Trek and you watch their science officer solve this problem, they're going to solve it in a different way. This just felt like, we gotta show Rock Talk doing math so that little girls think math is cool. And I think basically everything the show does with Rock Talk is excellent as far as inspiring little girls to get into STEM. It's so much more effective than a lot of other media's attempts to achieve the same thing. And the way they do it is suitably subtle most of the time that they really actually make science look very cool. This one bothered me though, because everything else Rock Talk does is so normal for a science officer and so actually realistic. Anyway, I don't even know what I wanted to say here, but apparently in my notes I just wrote, this series is one long Janeway Chakotay fanfic to get people to watch it, and it's working. I guess I don't really need to elaborate on that one. So the next episode is Where Sleeping Borg Lie. Overall, I think this episode is good. That being said, it does have a resolution that I hated, but maybe my reason for hating it is wrong. I never actually got to the part of Voyager that deals with the Borg, and from my understanding, the Borg in Voyager are much less powerful than they are in TNG. I have already observed a lot of the Borg appearing in, Enterprise, but also in TNG, and they cannot be defeated by the power of friendship. However, from my understanding, Voyager Borg are much less powerful and much more likely to be able to be defeated by the power of friendship. So, I guess, but to me it just felt wrong in the moment. Other than that, though, this episode is very cool. I'm going to talk about this a little bit later, but I still feel like Zero is the character that I have my finger on the least. And I think it's that Zero has a lot of minor characteristics from a lot of other characters from other shows, but I don't feel like I've connected strongly with their core. But I'll get to that later. I think Zero is not a bad or weak character, but I do think that I respond less to Zero than I do to the rest of the cast. And I'm really hoping that going forward in the series, we explore their character in a way that makes me understand them and connect with them a little bit better. Their character design is very, very cool, and they have a lot of individual elements that are very strong. However, there's something about the way it all comes together that I have not yet connected with. I do feel some amount of vindication, by the way, that when we covered the Borg in Enterprise, I said, wouldn't it be much more effective if they had swords? Gwen brings a sword to this Borg fight, and it does work, mostly. So, yes. Another thing I'd like to point out about Gwen in this episode is that at one point she has to walk through a large group of Borg, and Janeway is coaching her through it on comms and says, if they don't see you as a threat, they will not go after you. So you have to just walk normally, do not make eye contact, don't appear threatening, don't brandish your weapon, just walk through and they'll leave you alone. And this is very difficult for her to do. And this is the part, and I feel kind of embarrassed by this, this is the part where I put together that the Valnicut are supposed to be seen as a very violent species. I can't believe I didn't notice this before, but Vulcans are logical, Tellarites argue, Andorians are militaristic, and the Valnicut solve their problems with violence. Which I guess I really should have put together by the fact that the most important thing about their species is that they blew themselves up in a nuclear civil war that decimated their entire planet. But honestly, I'm so used to the tell-over show that we've been seeing in other Star Trek that I didn't notice. And it adds a lot of understanding to my concept of the Vaunakot as a species, as well as their place in the Star Trek universe, as well as, you know, why they got to the place where they are and what they are supposed to represent. The Vaunakot blew themselves up because they are not only very warlike, but they feel superior. This is a story about nationalism. The Vaunakot, half of them wanted to join the Federation, and the other half said, we're better than all those people. We shouldn't help them because we're superior. That is why, when the Diviner went back in time, he felt completely fine enslaving alien children because he felt that his race was inherently superior, and it was okay to do it to these kids because they aren't Vaunakot. This, to me, makes the Diviner feel much less like a cartoon villain and much more like a real-life, actual bad person who has power. I do want to clarify that when I say that other Star Trek shows are very tell don't show, I don't mean to say that as a criticism. The reason that previous Star Trek series relied much more on just coming out and saying things is because these shows came on weekly, and there wasn't really a way to rewatch them for a very long time. So if you missed an episode, you had to be caught up, or if an episode aired a couple of months ago, you might not remember. For this reason, television relied a lot more on simply telling you things than using subtext or whatever. In the case of Prodigy, even though the series can be watched on a week-by-week basis, the expectation is that people largely won't. They will and they won't. There will be some people watching week by week, some people who catch up and watch 3 or 4 at a time, some people who pick up the DVDs later and watch the entire thing in one sitting. And when, say, The Next Generation was coming out, the writers didn't have the idea in mind that a viewer may sit down and watch an entire season all at once. That is simply a difference between the way television used to work and the way television works now. The next episode is All the World's a Stage. I think it's a credit to Prodigy that when we come to an episode like this, I don't write in my notes that this episode sucked. I write that I didn't get it. I have enough faith in the Prodigy writers that when I don't like something, I expect that it's because there's something wrong with me and not there's something wrong with the show. That being said, I didn't like this episode. What's interesting to me is that a lot of people really, really liked this episode. Apparently, there was somebody who competed on a game show cosplaying one of the Enterprisians. I honestly think that the animation is really what hurt this episode for me. Obviously, the animation is still very beautiful. There are new environments, and they are all very well realized and very well thought out. However, I have always had a little bit of Uncanny Valley effect from the way the characters move. And in this episode, with the large quantities of Enterprisians that are on screen, the way they move and the fact that there's so many of them and they're all dressed the same way, to me, made me feel like I was looking at a school video game. Even though I know intellectually that exactly as much effort was put into this episode as was put into the last one with the Borg, which was also full of nearly identical characters all moving in tandem. But there was something about this episode that just didn't rub my brain correctly. And I love Galaxy Quest. I love the Orville. I didn't like this one. So in All the World's a Stage, the characters answer a distress call, apparently a distress call that has been going off for 100 years. They go down to a planet and find that there is a species of humanoids who worship the original crew of the Enterprise. Well, not the original crew of the Enterprise, the crew of the original series Enterprise. And they put on stage plays of the adventures of the Enterprise, and they name their children after Sulu and Uhura and all that, they call themselves Starflight, and they have a linguistic shift where they know most of the things they're supposed to know about Starfleet and about the original series, but because 100 years have passed, they don't pronounce things correctly. They don't say live long and prosper, they say live logs and proper, I think. They don't do this, they do... I'm not left-handed. They don't do this, they do this. It was just cringy enough to cross the barrier for me. There's an extremely cringy episode of this set that's Masquerade, in which Dal is a total moron, and I liked it. This one, I didn't like it. I'm just gonna move on from this one. I thoroughly hated it both times I watched it. I actually did not love the Borg episode the first time I watched it, but the second time I watched it, I really liked it. This one, I watched it twice, and I didn't like it either time, and I'm going to accept that one as being a problem with me, since apparently everybody else on the planet disagrees with me. Crossroads. Right out the gate, I'd like to toss out that Crossroads features a one-time appearance uniform for the kids. That's their snowsuits. And they look really, really good. I just want to toss this out because the kids rarely change clothes for budgetary reasons. And it was noticeable. It added a whole lot to the episode. I liked it. The only thing I wrote in my notes the first time I watched this was OMG, except I wrote each of those letters 8 times. Dal, really? So what happens in this episode is the characters decide they are going to leave the Protostar behind and hitch a ride to the nearest Starfleet base so that they can call Admiral Janeway or call somebody and tell them what's going on with the Protostar. The series actually makes an effort to try to show that the kids tried everything and it didn't work, in order to try to keep the audience from being frustrated that the kids didn't try enough things. However, that is something that the writers tried and it kind of didn't work. The first time you watch this episode, it is frustrating because it feels like you're just being teased. But the second time I watched it, this was definitely one of my favorite episodes. I really liked it a lot. Once I sort of accepted that the kids were not going to meet up with Admiral Janeway until the end of the season, this episode improves vastly on rewatch. So what happens in this episode is the kids go to park the Protostar under a huge pile of snow, which is cool, and they go to a trading center, which is also where Barnes Frex is waiting to be picked up by Admiral Janeway. So the kids encounter the crew of the Dauntless, and each individually interact with someone they should be talking to, but for various reasons, none of them actually are able to make real contact with the crew of the Dauntless. Rok-Tahk just walks past Tysus. Asensia talks to Gwyn and really badly misjudges how much Gwyn wants to see her dad again, so Gwyn runs away. Jankum gets into an argument with the Tellarite doctor, whose name I never caught, and but this is honestly one of my favorite scenes in the entire season. The best part is when Dal meets Vice Admiral Janeway for the first time, and he gives her this most "Are you my mother?" stare. He tries to talk to her about the problems that their ship is having and what he knows, but Barnes Frex walks up, so he runs away. The thing is that teenagers are not typically trusted or liked in general. When I was younger and I looked more like a teenager, several times I would go to a store and be accused of stealing if I was just shopping because I had pink hair and was wearing ratty jeans. Dal doesn't believe that he will be believed. And for a moment, he believes that maybe Vice Admiral Janeway will believe him, but he has so little trust in authority and adults that when the Denobulan approaches Janeway, he immediately feels like the whole battle is lost. I think it makes perfect sense for Dal as a character. However, it's not immediately obvious during this episode that this is going to have lasting consequences. So on first viewing, this episode can be a little bit frustrating to watch. At the end of the episode, you feel like maybe actually nothing has changed, except they gained Okana. Now, later on in this season, I think maybe even the next episode or potentially the next, Janeway reflects on this encounter and comes to the conclusion that Dal is probably not a bad person, and really effectively pieces together everything that has happened that she didn't see just based on the surrounding evidence. But in the moment, it feels like pushing the progression of the plot forward just a little bit for the sake of pushing it forward. And I don't mean pushing the plot forward, I mean pushing forward the part where we get to the plot. The next episode is Masquerade. This was one of my favorite episodes. I understand this is probably not everybody's favorite. Specifically, one of my favorite things about this episode, probably my favorite thing about the entire season is the opening rant that Dal goes on about how much he hates Okana. So at the end of the last episode, the characters pick up Okana. Okana is a character from The Next Generation who showed up for a single episode that was so hated that they keep bringing Okana back in various Star Trek shows. But anyway, so Okana was a really, really annoying guy who was supposed to be like a crappier version of Han Solo, almost like a Han Solo spoof. He gets picked up by the Enterprise when he's in trouble in The Next Generation, and he just annoys everyone borderline to death while he's on the ship. He's not ultimately a bad guy. He just kind of sucks. And it was absolutely a stroke of genius to include Okana in Prodigy. So I've been watching Star Trek Enterprise, obviously. I've brought that up like 4 or 5 times by now. But I have the Blu-rays of it. And the Blu-rays come with interviews from the writers and actors and directors. And I was shocked and disappointed when I listened to these special features. So Star Trek, before the 2009 movies, was a very different franchise. And that is specifically because, for a lot of reasons, but one of those reasons is because Star Trek never employed Star Trek fans to work on the series. Anyone who was a Star Trek fan was not allowed to write because it was seen as a volatile choice to choose someone who was that passionate. You needed somebody who was more disconnected to make more cogent decisions on behalf of the canon, right? However, the result of this is that you frequently had writers who had never seen Star Trek and literally didn't watch any episodes in preparation for writing for Star Trek. So on Enterprise, it was very common for, let's say, a writer to be introduced into season 3, and they would ask to watch 2 or 3 or 5 of the best episodes to get a feel for what a good episode is supposed to be like, and they would just never watch the rest. So you had a bunch of writers on staff who were really just clocking in and out, had no understanding or care for the source material, had never seen Star Trek, didn't care about Star Trek, didn't intend to ever care about Star Trek, and were really doing this to receive a paycheck. Post the 2009 movies, this policy changed. The majority of people who are writing for Star Trek and making decisions on behalf of Star Trek are actually fans, people who grew up watching Star Trek. I think this has been an improvement overall, just an incredible improvement in pretty much every single way. There have been some complaints that Picard was too fan servicey regarding The Next Generation, but overall I think the rest of the changes have been received positively. Lower Decks is a show that is literally intended to be watched by people who have seen all of Star Trek, and as far as I can tell, everyone who contributes to Lower Decks has seen all of Star Trek, potentially even multiple times through, and the understanding of the causality and everything that has ever occurred in Star Trek is extreme. Strange New Worlds is a very deep study into everything that occurred on the original series and how that might have come to pass. It's a prequel to the original series that seeks to explore the characters in a way that they have never been explored. Strange New Worlds has been very highly received, and it can only be highly received because the people who write it actually care. And I think we're absolutely seeing the same thing with Prodigy. In the case of Prodigy, we have ties every episode, well, at least in the second set, there are ties every episode to things that have occurred all across Star Trek. Actually, even in the first set. Medusans, the species that Zero is, were only mentioned in, as far as I remember, 1 episode of the original series. They're very, very rare. It's a very deep cut. I mentioned that Brickers, this species that Roktok is, they were actually pulled from a 1993 novel. They were never even mentioned in the show. Right now I'm watching season 4 of Enterprise, which deals with the augments. It's interesting to see how that ties into everything that's occurring with Dal this season. Okana, obviously a character who existed only in one previous episode of The Next Generation. This series, as a sequel to Voyager, needs to understand everything about Janeway's character, especially because if you ever watch Kate Mulgrew talk about Prodigy, she is incredibly passionate about both Prodigy and the character of Janeway. Kate Mulgrew is not going to be here and defend this as passionately and have this understanding if there's not something to understand, if there's not a real story to be told. Prodigy is the continuation of Janeway's story, the story that was first told in Voyager. And we have multiple versions of Janeway, we're exploring multiple aspects of Janeway. This is a series that was developed by someone who truly loves Star Trek, and the improvement is, in my opinion, obvious and drastic. Okana is a grown-up version of Dal if he stopped growing where he is. So we saw something like this in the last set. So in episodes 1 through 10, well, in specifically episode 7, we saw the woman who raised Dal, Nandi, a woman who bears incredible resemblance to the version of Dal we saw at the beginning of the series. She's a con artist, a manipulative, lying, selfish person. We saw Dal observe her, see her flaws, and then discard the parts of himself that reflected them. He got to see his parent figure with more mature eyes after going away from her for a long time and spending a lot of time with Janeway. And he got to see what was wrong with her way of life and what was wrong with what he got out of her way of life. So now Nandi is sort of behind him. You know, he has developed past taking after Nandi for the most part. But what if he doesn't go to Starfleet? Like, what is Dal like now? And Dal is very much like Okana. I actually rewatched The Outrageous Okana this week in preparation for this video, and Dal dresses very much like Okana. Okana used to have a ponytail that is in the exact same place on the back of his neck that Dal's tail thing comes out of, and I suspect they actually had him cut his hair for this episode because it would have been too on the nose if he just looked the same as he had looked in the TNG episode. Okana he's a starship captain, and he, has kept himself alive, but he's kept himself alive by smuggling, being generally kind of crap at everything. He's a smuggler, but he frequently doesn't follow through on what he's supposed to be smuggling. He's always questioned wherever he goes. He does his business in the worst parts of the galaxy. He's not happy. He doesn't seem to have grown or changed much in the last, is it 20 years? It's probably 20 years since The Outrageous Okana and this. So if Dal ended up like Okana, it would be fine. Like, it would be okay. He would be alive, but it wouldn't be as cool or good as if he ended up like Janeway. But we do have to inspect where he's at. So what happens in this episode is that Okana comes onto the ship and he starts doing all of the things that Dal normally does. Obviously he's a starship captain already, but he sits in Dal's captain's chair. He solves the problems that Dal would normally be solving. He even flirts with Gwyn and Janeway. I don't think he actually flirts with Gwyn. It's just the way Dal sees it, but anyway. And Dal absolutely despises this guy. So the opening sequence in this episode is a captain's log in which Dal is narrating how much he hates Okana. Specifically, he hates the fact that everybody else has taken to Okana for doing the things that Dal normally does, and they don't automatically defer to him. This is a rivalry that exists purely in Dal's mind. I don't think Okana thought about Dal more than once, if even once. Okana pretty much comes into the ship and thinks, oh wow, very cool, this ship full of children, maybe I can take it. He doesn't seem to think he can steal the ship, but he thinks of himself as being in charge because he's the only human adult around. And I mean, Janeway, but you get what I'm saying. He sits in the captain's chair. He basically assumes he's making decisions on the part of the group, and it's little things that just kind of drive Dal up the wall. So when we started last season, Dal was overconfident. He thought that because he had grown up on a starship, he obviously knew everything that he needed to know to be captain of a starship, and he couldn't possibly learn anything at Starfleet Academy. However, the Kobayashi Maru and then the subsequent events like dealing with Nandi and dealing with the Diviner really broke down his confidence. He thought he was the absolute best and had nowhere to grow, but since his confidence got knocked down, it got knocked down a little bit too far. He realizes he's not perfect, but he doesn't know what he is. So he's kind of holding out hope subconsciously that his species is something very, very special and cool. It's kind of important to his identity that he is mystery species. The other thing is that we found out last season in Dreamcatcher that Dal thinks his parents lost him. He believes that his parents would want to see him again and that he was probably taken from them. He thinks that somewhere out there his family would appreciate having him back. So in this episode, they go to illegal science planet, and a geneticist tells Dal that he has no parents. He's an augment and was born in a petri dish. This absolutely shatters whatever remaining self-worth he had, as well as the hope that his family is out there looking for him, or that, he has some card up his sleeve that is a positive that he could pull. If it turned out that he was a specific species that had a home planet, he could go to that home planet, but he doesn't. If it turned out he had a family, he could potentially find them, but he doesn't. It turns out that everything there is to him is what he already knows. He is a blend of 26 different species, something that somebody probably created just to see if they could. And he has no particular special abilities. It does turn out that he is very slightly capable of telepathy later, but it's not reliable, and it is probably not something he's going to use very often. And he was only able to use it without touching someone when he was on the when he had the genetic implant that was augmenting his augment abilities. So the point here is that Dal had two possible paths: find out where he came from or go to Starfleet. And now he knows where he came from, so the only direction he can go is Starfleet. Or he can become Okana, but he hates Okana. So Gwyn sits down with him and is like, listen, I understand this is a big blow for you, but, it doesn't change the way we see you. To us, you're still the same person. Now, the problem with this is that Dal believes he wasn't enough in the first place. Gwyn saying you are still the same person means you are still not enough. He later cites his reason for taking the implant as, I wanted you to look at me the way you look at Okana, which both refers to he doesn't feel like Gwyn likes him enough, but he also doesn't feel like his crew likes him enough. He doesn't feel like his crew sees him as a real captain. And he also doesn't see himself as being enough. So Dal gets conned into taking this genetic augmentation implant, which will sort of allow him to use whatever abilities other species would be able to draw on if he was fully a member of that species. What's really interesting about Dal is that he is actually an incredible judge of character. Everyone we've seen him judge throughout the series, he's always right, unless that person is trying to manipulate him. He spots the manipulation of basically every single person in the series, unless they are talking to him and trying to lie to him. It's his blind spot. Except for Larry the Murder Planet, he did actually call that one good job. So this geneticist is able to get him to take this implant basically by knocking him down and manipulating his emotions while he's in her office. She says, it's a wonder you can even speak. Basically, she says that he's so messed up genetically, he shouldn't be able to function, and it's very cool that he's even sentient. He was already struggling with his confidence, then he's further destabilized, and then the presence of Okana just makes it worse, along with Gwen's comment about, this not changing the way she sees him. So he takes this implant, and it is horrible. Like, it's nowhere near the promise that Dr. Jago made to him. It basically causes him to activate all of the latent genes that he has at the exact same time, and he starts like throwing up blue goo, and he develops like Klingon ridges and the mustache and a beard and pointy ears, and he starts talking about himself in the third person and talking about logic because he's 3% Vulcan and 3% Romulan. He's very briefly telepathic, and he knows a whole lot of really big words. I do want to point out that the scene where he is trying to use really big words, I think that we were supposed to think that he actually already knew those words. Like, this is not something that came from the implant. Like, he activates the implant later. He already knew those words, and we know that he can do telepathy later on. So all of that stuff that he was doing was just in his head. He starts just like doing random martial arts in the middle of the street because he's turned into a mall ninja. Eventually they get into a fight with a bunch of Romulans. Okana runs away, and Dal fights them off before he starts just like vomiting blue goo everywhere. This had the potential to be really annoying and cringy, but the fact that it's played for humor it really saves it. Like, if this was played for drama, it would have been bad, but instead it's supposed to be funny, and it is very funny. Brett Gray clearly had a lot of fun playing this episode. The other thing is that he almost did not take the implant. He says this, if it seems too good to be true, it probably is. He starts to walk out, and then he changed his mind, and that flipped it from being Dal's an idiot to me going, oh, you almost got it, you'll get it next time. You almost made a good decision, but I'm sure eventually you will become a good decision maker. I like this episode a lot. It was good. We also get Murph turning into a combat Pikmin. That was interesting. I feel like I have to wait a little bit to talk more about Murph. Yeah. So the next episode is Preludes. There are a lot of comparisons that can be made between Lower Decks and Prodigy. They are both shows about underdogs kind of becoming captains. They are both animated in 20 minutes, and that's the important part. Lower Decks does episodes with a lot of little vignettes really well. My favorite episode, potentially in all of Star Trek, is Lower Decks Season 2, Episode 9, Wedge Douge. I don't actually know how that's pronounced. In Wedge Douge, we get 5 little plot lines with a bunch of new characters where we see the Lower Decks from 5 different alien ships as they each witness the same battle from a variety of different angles. It's an incredible episode, made especially incredible by the fact that it's only 24 minutes long, and we develop a cast of about 30 characters within that time frame. However, Prodigy is a more emotional, more sentimental, deeper character development show than Lower Decks. The character depth in the main cast is comparable between Lower Decks and Prodigy. However, the background characters in Lower Decks can have these little vignettes that are a minute long, and it doesn't feel rushed. In Prodigy, in this episode, we get the backstory for 4 characters, and I think because these characters are more important, and this episode didn't have the comedic tone that Lower Decks usually takes, I feel like the episode felt rushed. Maybe we should have moved the Diviner's backstory to a different episode. Then again, that might mean people would skip this episode in the future, so maybe not. There wasn't anything specific that I felt was wrong with this episode. I felt the transitions felt kind of rushed, and I think this could have been more effective in certain character stories if we'd had a little bit more time. So let's go through these backstories really quickly. So the first one was Rock Talk, but before we get there, I want to say that Zero broadcasting everybody's thoughts to everybody else is a real problem. I don't mean in the terms of writing, I mean in the terms of the ship. So Zero's a telepath, and they constantly are telling everybody else what one person is thinking. They're friends with Gwyn because Gwyn's the only person whose mind they can't read, which is neat, but it's a problem that every time anybody thinks anything, Zero tells everybody else what they're thinking. It's just annoying. It would suck to be on a ship with this person. I hope they address this at some point. It's not that much of a problem, but it feels like a little bit of a shortcut. I wish there had been a little bit more time in this episode where they could say coax Rock into opening up normally, instead of just Zero saying, "Ah, yes, Rock Talk has a tragic backstory." Rock Talk, why don't you tell us your tragic backstory, right? It felt like a shortcut, and I wish they would just remove this. However, that would be removing one of the only aspects to Zero's character that is consistent right now. So the first step is developing Zero more. So Rock Talk's vignette feels the least effective to me, I think, because it feels like we're just kind of shoved into it. The transition into this vignette is very jarring. Well, I found it to be very jarring. However, I think the actual content of this vignette is very potent. There was something off about it to me. I think it's just because I feel like Rock Talk has grown up since then, and I wish that she had shown a little bit of introspection while telling this story, because instead I felt kind of like she had regressed in this story. Anyway, so Rock Talk's backstory is that before she was a slave on the mining colony, she was a slave for sort of a like a traveling circus or a Renaissance fair type thing, where she played a monster in a show, and she had to fake getting beaten up by this grizzled older slave. The older slave, she calls the hero, doesn't speak the same language as her. They can't communicate. They just have to show this. They have to give the same show day in and day out. If they do well, they are given a bowl full of nutritional slop. Rock Talk, as she got older, started to resent the fact that everyone was afraid of her. She constantly had to play this monster to be defeated, but she never was welcomed by the audience. They just enjoyed seeing her be defeated. So at one point, she turned the narrative on its head and threw fruit at the hero and tried to be the hero for a show, not understanding really her situation, and they sold her into slavery to the mining colony the following day. I mean, she was already a slave, but they sold her to the mining colony the following day because they saw her as no longer being obedient. Good God, everything we learned about this kid is worse. I should have probably gotten who wrote this, but I saw this post on Tumblr a couple days ago that said, in the holodeck, Rock Talk plays with a very Nintendogs kind of game called Delta Heart Veterinary Clinic, in which it's an obvious like little kids game where she treats fuzzy little animals in the holodeck. And somebody said that is the first time Rock Talk has ever had a toy. And man, there is something about the direction to this vignette that I found to be lacking in comparison to the others. That being said, everything about Rock Talk's story has just been incredibly potent. She's obviously the standout supporting cast member. Wow. I'm constantly impressed with how they skate the line between a character that little girls will find cool and admirable and a character that the adults feel very, very sorry for. Then we have Zero's. Zero's I also felt was a little bit short. Not the transition. I felt the transition towards Rocks was short, but Zero's actual story I felt was kind of missing some things. So basically, Zero was captured by poachers. And we saw their hive mind, and we saw their like community and how they were separated from the rest. However, It's unclear. There's a big question on my mind after seeing this, which is, why doesn't Zero go back to their homeworld? In this case, they had been on a ship, so they were no longer on the actual homeworld, but like, why doesn't Zero try to find the rest of their hive mind and go back? And on second viewing, it looks like the rest of the hive mind abandons Zero. They see that Zero is being chased by these poachers, and they get back on their spaceship and leave. However, it's kind of unclear. And I feel like if it was the case that they abandoned them, that would be pretty significant, right? Like, that would have come up. Zero would be like, you know, I used to be part of a hive mind, but they abandoned me when a bunch of Kazon chased after me, and now I'm by myself. Or it might have come up in the Borg episode, but instead, it seems like that was just not really part of that narrative. And so I don't know why Zero doesn't want to return to their hive mind, because they always talk about what life was like in the hive mind and how wonderful it is to be part of a hive mind. So why are they not going back there? Again, I feel like Zero is probably a great character that I don't feel like I've connected with yet, because I don't feel like I understand certain key things that I wish I understood. Jankum's backstory was definitely my favorite. You could have absolutely shown this as an episode of Love, Death, Robots, and it would pass as a short film. Basically, we see that Jankum used to talk normally, but he had to fix this ship with the help of this auto robot thing, and over the course of some unknown amount of time had to repeat his name to the robot so often that it sort of broke his speech pattern. And then afterwards he was on the mining colony and didn't have a translator, so we assume he was just talking to himself for the next couple of years. So he talks about himself in the third person now because he spent so long talking about himself in the third person in this story. It's a long sequence of him just fixing toilets, fixing sprinklers in the Arboretum, and fixing various things, but then eventually what happens is he exerted himself so much that the ship no longer has enough oxygen, and he puts himself on an escape pod so that everybody else will be able to breathe, and then he's immediately captured. What's really interesting about this is that he was on a sleeper ship, which is like a ship where the Tellarites were cryogenically put to sleep. And this actually predates... So he's older than the characters on Enterprise, which happened 200 years ago. He didn't know that Tellarites were part of the Federation because the Federation didn't exist when he was born. So the rest of his sleeper ship is still asleep. Just traveling through space. They've been sent to fight in a war that almost certainly is no longer going. This was the episode that really made me like Jankum a lot. I feel like I really connected with him in this one, especially because I understand his speech pattern now. I feel like I can kind of see through it and see what's behind it. I also really liked his development with thinking that thinking that Tellarites will be treated as royalty, but not realizing that everyone in the Federation is equal, and he is still seen as a runt. Jankum was definitely the character that improved the most in my eyes this set. Not as far as character development, but as far as how much I liked him before this set relative to how much I liked him afterwards. Finally, we get the Diviner's backstory. Again, maybe this could have been in another episode, but then people might skip it. This one was obviously really cool. We get kind of a painterly effect to the animation, and it's a flashback to what Solemn looked like around the time of the Civil War. The way Essentia and the Diviner talk about the Federation is really interesting, because they talk about the Federation being a primitive alliance, basically saying, why would we join the Federation? They just want our superior technology and superior weapons and all that stuff. We shouldn't trust them because they want something from us. Where the idea of an alliance is that everyone benefits. And this reflects Dal in last season really, really effectively, because Dal didn't want to join the Federation for almost the exact same reason. I like how in this set of episodes we're really developing the Diviner as a reflection of Dal, because I've been really impressed with this series' overall thematic coherence, acceptance, authority, belonging, a sense of superiority over humility is a set of beats that we just have woven throughout the story really well. I really liked this insight we get into the Vaunakot. Actually, I like every insight into the Vaunakot. I'm really looking forward to the fact that we're going to Solemn next season. I'm excited to learn a lot more about them. But one thing that I just want to point out, so they said we knew, our best scientists said we had a 1% chance of finding the protostar. So we sent 100 ships, the last of our forces, one person on each ship and one dreadnought. So they had 100 ships, 100 robots, and they sent 100 people, one on each ship. Most of them died in the passage. They are so allergic to problem solving, so allergic to conflict resolution, that they got to the point where they had 100 people left, and they decided their best solution. I mean, you could definitely make the argument that at this point their best solution is to go back in time and try to stop this from happening. But they had 100 ships, they had 100 robots. If you have 150 people, you can restart a society because you have sufficient genetic diversity to rebuild that society, right? Like, they didn't use the last of their forces to lay down their arms and try to rebuild. They instead decided to use the last of their forces to go kill somebody else. Actually, I'm sorry, correct that. They decided to use the rest of their forces to go kill everybody else. Everybody. The other thing I wrote down, so I wrote down a line from here that I wanted to think about. I was like, why is this bugging me? So Essentia and the Diviner are talking about, like, how their plan has gone well and how it has gone wrong and all that stuff. And Essentia says, why did your daughter betray us? And he says, she met a boy. That's not what happened. That is copium. In episode 1, you can tell that Gwen likes Dal to some extent. But she always puts her dad first. Like, she betrays Dal repeatedly for her dad's sake. She never doesn't put her dad before Dal. Even after her dad is dead. She betrayed her dad because he left her on Larry the Murder Planet to die. Like, this story would have been over so long ago if he didn't do that. Because when Gwen changed sides, Starfleet stood a chance. And the only reason Gwen changed sides is because her dad went after the protostar instead of her when she was being sucked in by the vines. If it was not for that one thing, he would have won this already. This would be over. And then after that, he goes, well, I see now that it was a mistake to leave you on Larry the Murder Planet to die. Please give me back the ship. And she goes, well, no, I'm not going to do that. And then he's shocked and appalled that this happened. And then only after that does she, begin to actually be on the same crew as Boy. This had nothing to do with Boy. So when I first saw this line, I thought that it was showing that the Diviner was blaming his problems on Gwen's silly teenage girl brain instead of taking responsibility. However, with the rest of the season in mind, I see that instead, this is actually a very important step for him. He is realizing that Gwen has her own desires and her own life outside of simply being his clone. And that is actually very important for him. He's not there yet, though. I like the overall messages in this episode. I didn't like how in this season I felt a little bit more like we had to say the message of the episode out loud every episode, but that's not the end of the world. I did like the message of this episode, which is don't compare trauma. Everybody has baggage, and there's no use trying to say whose baggage is bigger than other people's baggage. It only hurts the people around you to try to claim that your baggage is more important or bigger. Everyone is struggling and everyone has struggles, but it helps to talk about it. I did really like the message of this episode, even though like I said, this episode is really good. I just felt like the pacing was a little bit off. I'm not sure what should have been cut from elsewhere to make the flow of this episode a little bit better. So I can't complain too hard. It just it felt a little bit weird a lot of times when I was watching it. However, I did like this episode better than the following one. So I mentioned that I feel like when we try to do one story about each cast member, we don't have enough time to do it. We got that back to back in this set of episodes. So there was one story about each character in the Preludes episode, and then there was one story about each character in the Holodeck episode. A common complaint about Holodeck episodes is that they feel like they are wasting time and they don't achieve anything. And this tries to attack that by saying, okay, well, this is purposefully wasting time, and it did achieve something, which is screwing everybody over. I do feel like a lot of the percentage of this episode felt weak relative to some other episodes in this set. We open on the kids trying several different things in simulation to try to contact Janeway. I really liked this. I liked the fact that Dal learned from the Kobayashi Maru to try things over and over in the holodeck to see if they would work. I think this is really cool because it shows that Dal has figured something out himself, and it's a thing that is very distinctly him. Dal has the capacity to be too Kirk-like, right? Kirk constantly makes snap decisions and is kind of flying by the seat of his pants. However, Kirk has impeccable judgment. And so he's able to get away with it because he had experience. Dal doesn't have experience. He is much better at making snap decisions than, say, Gwyn. Although, you know, sometimes those snap decisions are getting an implant on an illegal science planet. But you know, we're not thinking about that one. He's able to make good command decisions in the moment, but he also needs to train. If he's ever going to be a real Starfleet captain, he needs to develop that good judgment. And the holodeck is a great way for him to replace his video game addiction with something that will allow him to actually be a better starship captain one day. We see that not only does he see repetitive exercises in the holodeck as a legitimate way to try to solve their problems, he also, in his recreational time, goes and captains a ship on easy mode in the pirate simulator. So this is the kind of thing that he's constantly thinking about. And if I was a real teacher at Starfleet Academy trying to advise a young cadet on what they should be doing to try to become a better starship captain in the future, what Dal is doing right now in this episode is exactly what I would advise them to do. After a series of failures, the kids decide that they are going to give up on trying to find Starfleet. They're just going to explore the rest of non-Federation space and see what happens. And this is actually a valid choice. They're no longer being chased by the Diviner. They don't have to do anything. They have a really cool, really fast starship. They're not particularly obligated to give it back. I mean, it's the right thing to do, but, you know, their ship has a virus. There's no reason to return it. They decide that, you know, maybe they won't go to Starfleet Academy and they'll just fly around space for the rest of the time. This activates the living construct. So they decide to take the evening off, eat a bunch of ice cream. My favorite joke from this set was Gwen is eating whipped cream directly out of the can. She goes, "This is delicious, but what kind of lunatic would whip cream?" You know, the kids eat some ice cream. I love the bit where Dal throws himself onto the bed and goes, "Computer, turn everything off. Let the darkness take me." What a drama queen. Anyway, the ship starts to malfunction in weird ways, and they realize that they are still inside the holodeck and they can't leave. The holodeck starts to try to lock them in there by enticing them with a mystery of the skeleton key. So we see into Zero's personal recreational holodeck program, which is a mystery game thing. And they are given the mystery that they have to find the skeleton key, and every time they look for more clues, they just get more clues. They never actually get to the skeleton key. Eventually they figure out that the skeleton key doesn't really exist. They are being locked in the holodeck because somebody's doing something to their ship. So we go through each of the characters' normal recreational holograms. We see the creatures that Rocktuck usually plays with in the Delta Heart Veterinary Clinic. We see the Mystery Society thing that Zero does. I thought that Zero's was the weakest. I felt like we spent a little bit too much time there. I don't know. I'm just, like I said, I'm really struggling to connect with Zero, and I don't know why. Um, I liked Jankum's Street Fighter Simulator. He fights a bunch of grown Tellarites that are bikers, and he is able to use magic in the holodeck, so he just beats them up. But the safety protocols are on, so it's really just beating them up for the sake of doing a violence. Kind of like playing a fighting game, right? You know, you're playing Smash not because you actually want to hurt your friends, but because it's satisfying to punch things. I liked that one a lot. Then we get Murph's. It was kind of weird. It was a black and white noir speakeasy, and Gwen's dad is there, and it just starts mushing together everybody's holograms. I have not yet put my finger on... I think you're not supposed to be able to put your finger on Murph. The show wants you to remain destabilized about whatever's going on with Murph at any given time, so that at the end of the series, Murph can become some kind of space whale or something. And it'll be really weird, but very cool, because Murph is always a weirdo. We see the pirate ship that Dal spends his recreational time on, and it feels like treading water. It feels like wasting time. And I felt that this episode was also pretty weak in that it tried to do too many things and it didn't do any of them well. Any of them except for one, the opening simulation, and for two, the reveal that Janeway is actually partially a manifestation of the living construct. This twist is incredible. It skews everything that Janeway has ever done, hologram Janeway, I mean. It explains all of her actions. Why didn't she care that a bunch of people stole the ship? She didn't, because she was able to convince them to want to attend Starfleet Academy. Why is she so friendly with the children? Well, she's the avatar of Starfleet. She's the face of Starfleet to the kids. If she can get them to look up to her, they will want to go to Starfleet. Why does she want to keep them alive? So that they can go to Starfleet. She has genuine care for them, but it explains away all of the inconsistencies in her character so effectively. The other thing it does is it flies them directly back to the Dauntless. They've spent the last couple of episodes getting away from Vice Admiral Janeway, but she flies them back to beyond Janeway's doorstep. It also takes us directly into the body swapping episode 18, Mind Walk. Mind Walk is definitely my favorite episode of the series so far. It's not close. Supernova Part 2 is the best episode, but Mind Walk is my favorite. What happens is Zero and Dal try to communicate telepathically with Janeway and instead accidentally swap bodies between Dal and Janeway. It's incredible. It is so funny. And it only works because at this point you know Dal really well. I was trying to think about it in terms of what would somebody think if they watched this episode first, and I think they would hate it. It would feel like defiling Janeway, this incredible character who is larger than life and is the embodiment of Starfleet to many people. But we know and love Dal at this point. I think a lot of the people who really, really hated Dal either flipped their opinion by now or stopped watching. So you have to at least tolerate him to get him to this point. And so his mannerisms that are very different from Janeway's are things that we recognize and are charming and funny. He uses finger guns all the time. Most of the humor in this episode comes from him just straight up not knowing how an admiral should behave. Not that he's misbehaving in any way on purpose, but that he doesn't know people's names. At one point he says, "Thank you for your service," and then just kind of realizes that he really messed up and walks away. His body language is very energetic teenage boy and not old lady, but the fact that he's in the body of what he perceives as an old lady, even though she's not that old, just to him, he's utterly baffled. He tries to sit cross-legged in her chair and falls off. Meanwhile, we cut back to the Protostar, and Janeway in Dal's body is sitting cross-legged, perched on the edge of the captain's chair, with her hands folded on her knees. It's hilarious. The voice acting in this episode is incredible. I listened to the explanation of how they did this, and it's exactly what you think. They had Brett Gray and Kate Mulgrew record both sets of lines. So Dal's voice actor recorded each line that Kate Mulgrew would have to say in his inflection. And it sounds fantastic. But we're able to achieve in animation something that can't really be achieved. I mean, it can be achieved, but it's much more easily achieved in animation, of lifting the animations, the body language from Janeway and literally applying them to Dal's character model, and vice versa. The finger guns that we've seen a million times on Dal just look ridiculously stupid and silly on Vice Admiral Janeway, but they're instantly recognizable because we've seen him do it a million times. The other thing is that, and I've somehow managed to avoid mentioning this up until this point, but the most important relationship in this series is between Dal and Janeway. Like, the heart of this series is the relationship between Dal and Gwyn. But the other most important relationship in this series is the relationship between Dal and Janeway. And I think of them very much as like Deku and All Might from My Hero Academia. An adult who genuinely has earned the reputation that they have, and the child who will take their place. Who is nowhere near their level, but you believe that they can be there some way, and you're rooting for them to work together to get the younger one to that point. Dal is not very much like Janeway, but he has a lot of her qualities. He has a lot of qualities that make us understand he will be a great Starfleet captain one day. And it is this dichotomy of their similarities and their differences that makes this episode so entertaining and so compelling. So Janeway is able to go over in Dal's body and just talk to everyone, get the full understanding of everything that's going on. She's able to cleanse the influence of the living construct from hologram Janeway so that she can behave freely. But Dal just does an abysmal job of impersonating Admiral Janeway and gets her thrown in the brig, and successfully. It was almost hard to watch. The rest of the crew thinks that she's developed like dementia, and they put her in sick bay, and it's awful. But it's very funny. Actually, the most significant thing that Dal does is talk to the Diviner. I guess we're gonna take a little detour now to talk about the Diviner again. So the thing about the Diviner is that he is not really the perfect Vaunakot. The ideal perfect Vaunakot is Essentia. Vaunakot are supposed to be cold, calculating killing machines. Not even cold, calculating killing machines, but like they put the good of Solemn first. The saying that he used to say all the time to Gwyn, there is no barrier we cannot overcome because we are Vaunakot. He's not saying there is no barrier we cannot overcome because we worked really hard and, if you stick your mind to it, you can, and believe in yourself. He's saying we are the superior race and therefore we can do it. This is why it's so significant that when he dies, he says to Gwyn, there is no barrier you cannot overcome because you are my daughter and not because you are the Ubermensch. What specifically makes the Diviner a bad Vaunakot is the fact that he cares about someone. The fact that he cares about his daughter. I know, cringe. When the Diviner initially tells Dreadnought that he wants to have a child, and he gives his, at the time, very logical reason, he says, I'm dying, I can't complete this, I don't think I'm going to be able to complete it within my lifetime. I need to have a child so that she will be able to complete the work. Dreadnought says, you should not do that, you will be emotionally compromised. The perfect Vaunakot is duty first. And he instills these values in Gwyn. Gwyn is, of course, ridiculously loyal to him, duty first, for as long as she possibly can, beyond the point where it makes real sense. But every time the Diviner interacts with anyone from Solemn, whether a robot or another Vaunakot, they are always irritated and disappointed in him for caring about Gwyn. he is not supposed to have connections to, you know, anything emotional. He's supposed to be this perfect soldier. He is supposed to have already given up his life and identity for the sake of blowing up Starfleet. But he has an identity outside of that. It's not a huge one, but part of his identity is being Gwyn's dad. Like, he gave up his name. You know, we call him the Diviner because he gave up his name, but Gwyn has a name, and he's Gwyn's dad. Like, that's important to him. But it's not supposed to be important to him, and anytime he interacts with anyone from Solum, they remind him of that. But what happens in this half of the season is that the Diviner is forced to interact with people who are not from Solum. When he was in charge of Tars Lamora, the Diviner was really only interacting with Gwyn and Dreadnought. You know, they did all of the translation and managed everything, and he swam in his tank. In this season, he is surrounded by the kindness and reasonableness of Janeway and the rest of the crew of the Dauntless, and he realizes, for one, it's difficult to continue to be racist when you're around reasonable people who are of the race you hate. I mean, is it racist if you hate everyone? I'm not sure. But the other thing that happens in this season is that Starfleet respects his love for his daughter. Essentia and both Dreadnoughts constantly disparage him for having an emotional connection, but the rest of Starfleet treats his connection to Gwyn as being as important as he wishes it could be. They see his motivation of protecting her as being enough. They go, oh, you want to protect your daughter? That sounds perfectly reasonable. So all of a sudden, the Diviner has something that he's never had before, which is a draw towards Starfleet. It's not even that Starfleet is associated with Gwyn. I mean, they are. But also the fact that Starfleet validates his care for her is something he hasn't experienced in a very long time. Well, ever. So the Diviner encounters Janeway, who he doesn't know is Dal. At this point, he's interacted with Essentia and pretty much realizes that things are probably not going to go exactly as she says they are. So he makes a deal with her and he says, I'm going to let you go, but you have to promise me that if I die, you will watch out for Gwyn. And Dal says, as Janeway, I get it. I would also do anything to protect Gwyn. And maybe the Diviner knows that that's Dal, although there wasn't really evidence. Like, maybe he suspects something is up, but this is the final nail in the coffin to say that, like, Starfleet cares about Gwyn, but Solum doesn't. Like, Gwyn exists to protect Solum, and Solum does not love her. No one from Solum, except for the Diviner, cares about Gwyn. But somebody at Starfleet, whether it's Dal or Janeway, somebody at Starfleet is going to make sure that she's okay after he's gone. This conversation makes his semi-redemption possible. And I guess we can go ahead and cover the fact that in the next episode, Supernova Part 1, he dies, protecting Gwyn from Essentia. This is not a real redemption. The Diviner still enslaved orphan children for 20 years and forced them to work in mines to try to find a weapon that he would use to blow up the Federation, like everyone in Starfleet. So he's not a good person. However, what this tells us is that he could have been a good person. Next season, Gwyn is going to be returning to Solum in order to try to change the future, to prevent Solum from becoming the lifeless husk that it is in the Diviner's timeline. And she cannot save the timeline that her dad came from. As far as I can understand of the timeline, Gwyn is not going to invalidate her own birth because the timeline splits when Gwyn makes first contact with Solum. But she intends to go make first contact with Solum, replace the first contact that went wrong the first time, and prevent her dad from becoming a bad person in the first place. Which I think is a really interesting direction for a Star Trek villain. The complaint at the beginning of the series, of course, being that the Diviner is too evil. in this season, we start to pull that evilness back. But next season, we're going to examine the question of, all right, you've got a really, really bad person. What if they had never become bad? What would we think of Hitler if he really had been an art student, right? Does the knowledge that in an alternate timeline somebody is a really, really bad person make them overall a bad person? So I'm really happy with the direction we're taking with the Diviner. Let's go on to the rest of Supernova Part 1. Supernova Part 1 and 2 is just an incredible piece of Star Trek. You could put it in a theater, and people would probably pay to see it. Hint, hint. And yeah, it was it was awesome. I mean, it just was. In this episode, the ship is boarded. Essentia kills Gwen's dad and activates their comm array so that the virus is let out to the other ships in the Federation. The other Starfleet ships that are in the area, which is all of them, start shooting each other. Pretty soon, the rest of the computer systems go down and everybody loses universal translators. Gwen has to take over as captain temporarily and call in help from the Klingon fleet to take shots while they try to solve the virus problem. It's a very, very cool episode. I do want to address something just because I saw this actually addressed a bunch of different places, and I wanted to give my own perspective. There's a scene that is very painful to watch, but in a good way. This is a very well written scene. I think it's a very well written scene, where Gwen goes to try to defend the ship from being boarded, and Dal tries to talk her out of using lethal force against the Starfleet troops because they are still trying to join Starfleet Academy. They're still trying to join Starfleet in general. So she found out in the last episode that he can't go to Starfleet Academy. She tries to tell him that they have made the decision to not allow him in because he's an augment, because of his race. She hesitates, and she, stares at him for, 10 seconds and introduces the topic in a really weird way, and he completely misreads her tone and thinks that she is trying to tell him that she has feelings for him before she goes off and sacrifices herself to the ship. So he tries to kiss her. She gets really upset and then tells him that, he did not make it into Starfleet Academy. He apologizes profusely for misreading the situation. And it's just it's a very well written scene, and it's very, very uncomfortable. And everybody in the scene and in the audience feels way worse after watching it. But it's one of the more effective scenes in the show so far as a bunch of things coming together all at the same time. Dal was already struggling with acceptance. He feels like he may or may not be good enough to be a starship captain. He doesn't know where he belongs in the universe because he has no family, but he's got a couple of things going for him, which is, the hope of being able to go to Starfleet Academy and the fact that he's pretty sure that Gwen likes him. And then he gets the double whammy of rejection from her. I mean, sort of rejection. They literally get together in the next episode. But, falling on his face really bad, trying to make a move on her, and then finding out that he's been rejected from Starfleet Academy because of his race, and or because of his species. And it's a very painful, very well written scene. And I saw a couple of people saying that this is a bad scene because Tal did not ask consent before trying to kiss Gwen. This episode is running really, really long, but I think it's important to include this personal anecdote because watching this series, I'm always conscious of what kids are getting out of it. When I was in high school, I was really, 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 I literally can't say really enough times, into Soul Eater. Soul Eater was a manga that, it was also an anime, a manga that was intended for people my age, high school, middle schoolers, high schoolers, with a main character who looked very much like me, and I idolized her. I've talked about her a little bit on this channel and how her behavior impacted me, but there's something I have not mentioned before. So the thing about anime is that they don't try to instill positive values into its audience. They do, but not the same way we do. And one thing that anime does a lot is it has girls who freak out and are really loud and abusive. Maka had this thing called the Maka chop, where she would hit people with a really heavy textbook if they pissed her off. This usually was aimed at her sort of love interest, the titular soul leader. The series was about their relationship, and if he ever did anything to piss her off, she would hit him with a book, and it was supposed to be funny. And what I, a teenager, gleaned from this was that boys ain't shit, and you can hit them with books. When I was 17 years old, I hit my boyfriend in the face in front of our families at my birthday party. He said something that was, I don't even remember what he said, but I felt like I was supposed to maintain dominance. I felt like I had to keep him in his place, and I also had to be this sort of anime girl insecure that I idolized, and I slapped him. And I had this attitude that kept him in check for a while after that, actually. Like, he did not break up with me for almost a year after that. And that was the kind of relationship that we had. This is definitely my biggest source of shame from my childhood. The fact that I was so absorbed by wanting to be Maka Albarn that I absorbed her abusive tendencies, that I did not see the flaws in anime girls. And I idolized them. I largely don't watch anime anymore because of things like this. There are some anime that I watch, but I'm now much more sensitive to the way girls are depicted, and the way that, like, the way it's very common for girls to freak out in anime like that. It really bugs me, and it bugs me to see teenagers watching anime if I know that it has this kind of thing in it, because I know that the kind of kid who is really into anime is the kind of kid who is susceptible to being like me. So when I'm watching Prodigy, I'm watching things like, how is science depicted? How are certain behaviors depicted? Like, what would a kid get out of this? There are certain things that I can't know what a kid would get out of it. But in the relationship between Dal and Gwen, I feel like I do know what a teenager would get out of it. And in this scene, Dal tries to kiss her, and it goes, like, this becomes his, like, the worst thing that has ever happened in his life up to this point. He actually takes the gun from Gwen and says, actually, I'm going to sacrifice myself from the ship for the sake of the ship. Please go back to the bridge. I'm taking this gun. See you later, or I won't. I'm okay with myself dying because of what happened just now. He specifically calls out, how sorry he is. It's specifically the apology that I found to be very important. He immediately reads that he did something wrong, something that upset her, and he addresses that he did something wrong and why. I think it is much more valuable to show your character screw up and apologize than to never screw up in the first place. When I was a teenager, I unironically told people that I don't apologize because apologies are for the weak. Dal is supposed to be a screw up. Dal is Okana right now, and he has to learn and he has to grow. And he learned in this scene that he messed up. But I think it was okay, and I also think it was positive to show. No one is good at romance when they're 17 years old. No one is good at romance when they're 17 years old. For me personally, it took a lot of deliberate learning for me to become empathetic as a young adult. There was also a little bit of complaining that, this should have happened later, that maybe we should get to this point with Dal and Gwyn this time next season. But I disagree with that as well. Because of my disastrous experiences as a teen with romance, I do a lot of research on psychology relating to romantic relationships and stuff. And, what should I do? What should people do? And one thing that I've learned and accepted is that pining is unhealthy for the human mind. It's not good for a person to pickle their mind thinking about another person. For maximum mental and emotional health, when you know you have feelings for someone else, you address it and give them the opportunity to accept or reject you, or say, hey, why don't I think about it? If you pine after someone for a period of years, it's not good for you, it's not good for them. You could either be in a relationship with that person or have moved on if it's not going to happen. But good communication is important from the get-go, and obsessing over someone else without talking to them about it is not good for human people. The slow burn romance is held up as the epitome of romance in the eyes of many people. You want people to develop as much as possible before they get together. But that's not actually good in real life. You don't want that. And I actually think it's a good thing that Prodigy represents the opposite. At the beginning of the series, it was obvious that there was some mutual attraction between Dal and Gwyn, but they weren't really in a situation where that looked like it would ever be possible. At this point, it does look like it's possible, and Dal addresses the topic when he thinks she is ready to address the topic, even though he is mistaken. I think this, where we see Dal screw up and have to fix it and have to show her respect and navigate this additional dimension to their interpersonal relationship, is much more valuable than the kind of thing where the two characters get together in the last 3 seconds, like in Avatar: The Last Airbender, or in Avatar: The Legend of Korra, or... Okay, I understand why that happened in The Legend of Korra. I'm just saying that it's better representation to show successful navigation of healthy relationships and successful problem solving than to simply not show the problems. I love the stylistic choice to never give subtitles to other languages. We hear a lot of other languages throughout this series. We hear Tellarite and Bricker and Andorian and stuff, and there's never subtitles. You're always in the dark. The show expects you to pay attention to try to figure out what is going on, and it also lends a feeling of importance to Gwyn's role. I was a little bit peeved in this episode that Essentia had the authority to override something on the protostar. However, I realized that she probably had that authority because of what happened on Solon and not because of what happened in Starfleet. So I guess that makes sense. Let's talk about Supernova 2. So in this one, the characters have to blow up the protostar. They realize that they aren't able to stop the virus. At first, I was frustrated by the fact that the virus doesn't spread. The virus, on a computer, a virus is a virus. It duplicates. However, I don't think they ever use the word virus, or if they do, it's by somebody who's very tangentially related to the situation. The living construct is not a virus. It's a device. Proximity to the living construct is what causes the symptoms. It's more like radiation than a disease. So the kids decide to blow up the ship, but it's explained that they couldn't have blown it up before because the resulting supernova would create like a 50 million light year ripple effect or something. I don't remember the exact number, but it was very big. They figure if they go to proto-warp and detonate the protostar while in proto-warp, they can distribute the explosion and not harm anything because space is very empty. I want to kiss the Prodigy writers directly on the mouth. The scientific problem solving is very good and very consistent and understandable. They show this graph of, the explosion could be this big, But if we elongate it and they show the points at which the explosion will occur. But somebody has to stay behind to pilot the ship, but it's okay because the ship has an autopilot who can die for them. A hologram Janeway tricks them into believing that she can be removed. She believed that she could be removed because she used to be a much dumber program, but now all of the information that she's gained over the course of the series has made her program too large to easily duplicate onto a USB drive that Dal can stick in his pocket. So she lies to them and gets them all to evacuate the ship. Janeway is the kid's mom, hologram Janeway. And leaving her behind is the end of their metaphorical childhood. They are moving on to the next phase of their lives and leaving their nanny behind. The hologram Janeway brought a lot of good to the kids. She was the first emotional support that Rok-Tahk really got. Dal clearly sees her as a mother. You know, the scene where she's fixing his uniform is very charming. And if it wasn't for the relationship between Dal and hologram Janeway, the most important relationship of the series between Dal and the real Janeway would not be possible. But the same is also true in the other direction. Hologram Janeway has been affected by her relationship with the children. She's more of a mom, like a literal mom, than Vice Admiral Janeway probably ever will be to the kids. Her relationship with the kids is her entire identity, because she doesn't remember her previous crew, and she doesn't appear to think about Janeway's past life very often. So Janeway blows herself up on the ship, and I actually, this was one of the things that unfortunately I knew was going to happen because I stumbled across a spoiler, and so some of the impact was taken out. But I am glad that I did not know that her dying words were "go fast." After this, the kids arrive at Starfleet Academy, and the real Janeway tries to defend their petition to get in. And the court, or whatever you would call those people, are very resistant to the idea of letting in Dal. They don't let in augments. We've known that, for hundreds of years now. And I watched this and I was thinking, Dal should not go to Starfleet Academy. Like, he needs to tell them that he's going to find his own way, because it shouldn't be up to him to make them not treat him like garbage. But on second viewing of Supernova Part 2, it is Janeway's encouragement to go to Starfleet Academy that convinced me that no, Dal needs to go. He is the Deku to Janeway's All Might. He cannot follow in her footsteps without joining Starfleet. If he does not join Starfleet, he will become Okana. And it's hologram Janeway's sacrifice that enables him to get there. So he has to make it worth it by sticking it to those idiots at the tribunal who see him as something that is only a subset of what he is. We also get some little vignettes from where everybody else is going. For one, 5 of the children will be accompanying Janeway on the Voyager A next season, which is pretty exciting. I'll talk a little bit about that later. I'll talk a little bit about Rok-Tahk later as well. Jankum, we just see him learning to be a real engineer instead of whatever the heck he is. And we see that Zero gets a new body that sucks less. And then finally we see a scene with Dal and Gwyn as they discuss the fact that she is going back to Solon. Previously on this channel, I've talked a lot about love triangles, and I don't mean the romantic kind. I mean the pull that a person experiences between two forces in their life. And Gwyn's love triangle is between Dal and her dad. Please do not make it weird. On the one hand, her dad is pulling her towards her duty of being basically the chosen one, and Dal is a personal desire. She wants to have a friend. She wants to have a friend who is a cute boy that she knows. But her duty as being this savior of Solemn is always more important, is always the most important thing in her life. So the question is always, is Gwyn going to be pulled back towards her dad or pulled back towards Starfleet and Dal? However, that's not healthy. In real life, this is not supposed to be a choice. In real life, people have to deal with both. In real life, people have families that they choose, but they may also have to deal with issues from an ailing parent. Or, most people have duty related to their job, but they also have a family that they go home to. When I saw this conversation between Dal and Gwyn about whether they were ever going to see each other again, I was like, haven't you guys seen Star Trek? The answer is no. I anticipated fully that when the kids go to Solemn in the future, 52 years in the future, they will see an old version of Gwyn who never returned. But I don't think that's where it's going anymore. I thought about it, and I think that Gwyn is supposed to achieve a balance. She does need to do her duty and save Solemn from itself. But a person is supposed to be more than one thing. I don't think the ending to Gwyn's story is that she gives up wanting to explore the stars and wanting to be with the rest of the crew and wanting to pursue her own interests and her own desires in order to protect her home planet from destroying itself. That's a tragic backstory for a Star Trek character that, is starting out. I think that Gwyn needs to discover that she needs to take care of herself in addition to taking care of her extremely violent nationalistic home planet. I also think it's really interesting that a lot of characters in this show have this tear between duty and selfish desire. In fact, almost every character in the show is pulled between duty and selfish desire. Her father, the diviner, his duty was to save Solemn from itself. Well, sort of. But his selfish desire was to care for his daughter. And he ultimately had to choose between these two things. And it was only when he went for his selfish desire that he became redeemable. Janeway is pulled between her selfish desire and her duty in that she has made it her duty to go after Chakotay, but she constantly wants to bend the rules and get herself into trouble, foregoing her duty in order to try to protect him. Dal's character development is formatted a little bit differently in that we are seeing the two versions of a person he could become at any given time, and then he's also constantly pulled between doing stupid stuff like playing video games and doing the responsible thing and being the captain of the ship. But I think that is also a reflection of duty versus selfish desire. Gwyn is too far in the duty direction at the beginning of the series, and Dal is too far in the personal desire direction. But I do think that Dal has made very, very good progress, and like I said, I think that what he's doing now is very good preparation for his future as a Starfleet captain. So let's real quick, oh my gosh, this video is long. Let's real quick go over each of the characters that we saw this season. So for one, let's talk about Zero a little bit. So Zero, I forgot to mention last week, so much of the plot and cast cohesion is possible because Zero reads Dal's mind and lets everybody know if he's being manipulative. However, once Dal becomes more trustworthy, this trait becomes less useful and interesting. Zero doesn't really use it anymore. This is just something that the story has kind of evolved past. It's interesting that Zero is several characters we've seen before. Zero is the Data, the person who feels differently. Zero is the 7 of 9, the person who used to be part of a hive mind and is getting used to not being it. Zero is the Deanna Troi, the person who can read the minds of oppositional forces and give information. And on top of all of that, they are the medical officer, and the kind of the joke is the person without a body is the doctor. I do think that their voice actor, Angus Imrie, really, really did a great job this season, particularly in the Borg episode. My biggest sore point for the series overall so far is the lack of connection that I feel with Zero compared to the level of understanding that I feel like I have with just about everybody else. So I'm really hoping that next season, since Gwyn's not going to be around, we're going to get more of Zero and potentially more of an arc with Zero. I think maybe if I had a clear idea of what Zero's arc is supposed to be, it would solve all of my other problems. Second of all, I'll talk about Jenkem. I thought that Jenkem's whole thing with thinking that the Tellarites are royalty and then finding out that that's not really the case, and also just generally finding out more about Jenkem, I really appreciated. I already thought that Jenkem was a funny character, but now he is a character that I genuinely want to see more of, and if I find out that next season we're going to have 3 episodes about Jenkem, which is a lot, I would actually be really interested. I want to know more. I want to see more of this character. I don't really know where his character is going, but I want to see it. I want to talk about Rock Talk. Last week I really thought she was going to become a computer engineer, and I guess I was wrong. I got really excited because she mentioned computer engineering, and the way the episode was formatted, I thought that was what she was going to do, but I guess not. But I thought it was really cool how this season everything is building up to her becoming a xenobiologist, and I didn't even put it together until they said it. We see her interacting with the pregnant whale. We see her playing these little veterinary games. We see her trying to cure Murph and her carrying Murph around and constantly monitoring his health. I thought that was great, but also on the representation for girls in STEM thing, she's borderline annoying, but not actually annoying, with how many times she always says, there has to be a scientific explanation. Every time they see something that looks suspicious, she gives a reason why it's doing what it's doing. And I really appreciate that, there will probably be kids watching this who take up this catchphrase, who see the way she thinks and want to adopt it, which I really appreciate, because there is a lot of science fiction that doesn't actually encourage understanding of science. There's way too much science fiction out there that says science is, the realm of God, and it is not the place of man to dabble with that stuff. Rock Talk makes science fiction approachable and science approachable. And on top of that, she's also just, as I've said repeatedly, an amazing character. Who else? Murph, along the same lines. I think I've already covered Murph for the most part. Gwyn, I don't think Gwyn has actually been written out of the story. I think that Gwyn is trading places with, her dad in part 1 and Janeway in part 2, where Gwyn is going to be on, a separate track next season, and they'll probably meet up at the end, where for all the rest of this season, part 1 and part 2, we spent 80% of our time with the main cast, and then we had 2 characters who were off doing something else. I think that next season we're going to spend 80% of our time with the main cast, and Gwyn is going to be off doing the saving Solemn thing. This is what I really hope, because I think that the whole idea of changing the future by changing the way the Federation is framed to the Vaunakot is really interesting, and I hope they actually explore this and show it on screen. I'm absolutely fascinated by everything we've learned about Solemn, and I want us to actually see this happen, so I really hope we continue to follow Gwyn as she's doing this task. Dal, I was going to make this a longer section, but I probably shouldn't, and we're way over time. But I always knew I was going to like Dal, because he bears an incredible resemblance to another character whom we have covered on this channel. My favorite fictional character of all time is the protagonist of Hive, another series that we covered on this channel, Otto Malpence, and he is a borderline identical character to Dal. He is a clone, a genetically engineered clone who thinks of himself as being way too much at the beginning of the series, then loses his self-worth to the point of no longer thinking that his life has any value, and placing a disproportionate amount of importance on the people around him because he feels guilty for being alive, and generally just struggles with self-worth when he realizes the truth of his birth. I knew that I was going to like Dal because I noticed the similarities between these 2 characters immediately, but I was tickled by the fact that Dal speedran Otto Malpence's entire character development in 5 episodes here. Actually 4, because he's willing to do the self-sacrifice thing in episode 19. He goes from being up here to way down here with the revelation that he doesn't exist the way he thinks he should exist in the universe. Just a connection that I drew. I know that means very little to most people watching this, but it was very meaningful to me. I loved the representation of social engineering that we saw in Essentia. She constantly mentions that, wouldn't Janeway want us to do this? And then people take that as Janeway's orders, even though she is just an ensign. We're definitely not losing Gwyn, because we have an actual evil version of Gwyn who is the new series villain. Anyway. Also, Jamila Jamil really kills being evil. I've never seen her be evil before, and it was pretty cool. I think that's all the characters I wanted to cover, because I talked a lot about the Diviner in the main section. So I just wanted to talk about some things that I'd like to see next season. I'm really hoping to see more Zero. I really think that we're going to see Gwen prevent her dad from becoming evil in the first place. I think that's really where we're leading the story. I would like to see at some point Prodigy tackle the mirror universe. They're really good at explaining Star Trek concepts. I think it would be interesting. I'm excited to see any interactions between Zero and the Doctor. I know the Doctor is going to be a character that is featured prominently next season. I'm hoping to see the character struggle to work under authority. Previously, up to this point, anytime the characters got irritated with Janeway, they could just turn her off. Now they have the real Janeway, and they have to accept orders from her, and she's the captain of the ship. I want to see them adapt to this new paradigm where they are not free-range children. My biggest desire for next season, this is my number one, everything else is number two to this. Don't make Dal develop backwards. I think Dal has had fantastic character development. The show has been written really, really well up to this point, but Dal has become dangerously close to being actually tolerable and a good starship captain. And I'm afraid that they will have to roll that back a little bit in order to make the second season work. Please don't do that. Oh my god. And then finally, I just want to say this isn't really for next season. Well, I mean, I hope that the whole series gets wrapped up. It gets as much time as it needs. I hope that it wraps up pretty quickly so we don't have to keep hoping that it doesn't get canceled in time to finish the story. But I've heard actually that there's rumors that Star Trek Legacy, which is going to be a follow-up to Picard, and all, from what I understand, it will include characters from Lower Decks. I've also heard that it will include characters from Prodigy, and it's supposed to take place about 20 years after this. I got to see an interview with Brett Gray, and it became immediately apparent to me that they literally just based Dal exactly on this guy. I mean, he is the actor for Dal, but like his facial expressions are the same and his manner of speaking is exactly the same. He's not acting. And I think it would be a real waste if they do not use Brett Gray in live action the same way they did with Tawny Newsome and Jack Quaid for Lower Decks in live action. I really, really hope that we get to see at least Dal in live action on Star Trek Legacy. We will see. So my phone's about to run out of space, so I have to end this video, but also it was really, really long. So next week we will be returning to our regularly scheduled Star Trek Enterprise, which has stopped being good as of season 4. And we will return to Prodigy as soon as new episodes are dropped. Yay! New episodes are going to be dropped. Have a good one. See you next time.